So we are in 1 Peter chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 1 tonight. If you have a Bible, go ahead and pull that out on your phone. If you have the rarely coveted paper copy of the Bible, pull that out too, because that is also important for what we're going to be discussing tonight. American author and businessman Patrick Lencioni says that servant leadership is the only kind of leadership. And I have to say that I agree with him. And Jesus would testify to the same thing. Because this type of leadership doesn't corrupt with power and control and money and schemes. This type of leadership puts you at the bottom rather than at the top. Sometimes our culture has this idea of what a leader is and says, a leader is somebody who has sway or influence, or they like the spotlight, right? And we have this skewed picture, and I really don't want us to get a bad image of, when we think of a leader, we shouldn't think of a politician, right? We shouldn't think of somebody who's running for office. Half the time, we don't even know if they're being real. We don't know if they are who they say they are. They can put on a facade in front of you, and you would never, ever, ever think twice that that person wasn't who they said they were. And traditionally, I don't think twice when I think of Jesus' leadership. When I look at the gospel accounts and I watch how Jesus led, what I see is someone who's not seeking clout or power or Lord, this idea of ruling over somebody. What I see is somebody who's coming to give his life. Something that, when you think about this, on Sunday morning, I'm just going to go off for a minute, because on Sunday morning, we take the Lord's Supper, right? We take the body and the blood in remembrance of Jesus' death. But I don't know sometimes if we think about this, and this is my reflection this morning as I was partaking of the Lord's Supper. They are the two indispensable things every human being has that no human's willing to give up. Indispensable. You cannot live without body and blood, period. And nobody in this room is willing to give that up. But here's a man who comes out of Nazareth, of all places, says he's going to die and be raised on the third day, and he does it. And then he teaches things like this we find in Matthew chapter 20 and verses 25 through 28. He said, "But Jesus called them to himself. You know the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many." Jesus is teaching us something important by comparing and contrasting the leadership of the Gentiles and the leadership of the kingdom. Because that's what the apostles will ultimately become. They will be the pillars of the church, leaders in the kingdom in service to the leader of the kingdom, the king of the kingdom. What kind of example do we set Jesus? What do we say? And he's saying this in context of James and John coming forward and saying, Jesus, when you come in your glory, can we sit at your right and your left? That's what he's saying in this in context of, and also in context of mirroring the leadership of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who use their teaching as a way to ensnare people and to hold weight over them, and to choke them out, and to make them not want to. They were all about the fame and the glory and being in front of people. Jesus says, do not do what you do to be seen by men, in chapter 6. So Jesus' style of leadership automatically points us to this idea of, if you want to be a leader, you have to lead from the lowest level. And you have to look within, and you have to say, you know what? Nothing is beneath me. Cleaning the bathrooms. Not the most fun job in the world. But we got a church, and we got people in it, and it's got to be done. Vacuuming the carpets, it's not the most fun job in the world. Maybe for some of you it is, I don't know. But we got people in this church, and it's something that needs to be done. I mean, there are all sorts of things. What is beneath me as a servant? Sometimes it's just you using your influence to listen to somebody who's going through something that they're struggling with. John Maxwell, another author and preacher down in Southern California, says this concerning leaders. A noble leader answers not to the trumpet calls of self-promotion, but to the hushed whispers of necessity. He's drawing off of Jesus' teaching. This is not about the trumpet calls of self-promotion. I'm pushing myself, putting myself out. This is what Jesus does. When he talks about leadership, he's talking about the lowest of the low. He says, you want to be first, you got to be the slave. You want to be the greatest, you have to serve everybody. You have to be the last one in line to get what you want in life in order to be the greatest in the kingdom. This is the mode that God's leaders are called to serve in. Elders, shepherds, overseers, pastors, teachers. This is what they're called to do, to serve at the lowest form in the church, to build up the church. It's giving of oneself more than you're getting for oneself. Leadership is about serving, not being served. This is what Jesus says. It's about serving, not being served. I'm not here to be served. I'm here to serve. If that's my attitude every time I step in this church building doors, every time I step outside my door, every time my wife greets me at the door, if that's my attitude, what kind of influence do I have? What kind of work am I doing in the kingdom for my family? If my daughter draws a picture and it's not very good, do I tell her the truth and hurt her feelings? Or do I find a way to build her up? You know what? That's really good, but you can do so much better, and you should try this. That's building up. That's what the kingdom's about. This is a book about God's people conducting or responding to suffering. How do we respond? And last week we kind of talked about this a little bit. This idea that the flesh reacts and the spirit responds. And there's a difference between the two. And Peter's playing off of this idea. Remember in chapter 2 and verse 12, Peter says this, keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles. In the midst of your suffering, you can't act like the world. You can't act like you don't have a place to go. You can't act like death is the end for you. You can't act like this is over. Remember who your Lord and Savior is, because he says it right down in verse 21 and 24. He says, Jesus suffered unjustly. And when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. Or how about in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, when speaking to wives, he says, here's what you can do if you have an unbelieving husband. In the midst of suffering, if you maintain the integrity of your behavior, they may be won without a word. Because your life is devoted to Christ. Do you react or do you respond? And this is what Peter is trying, the dynamic that Peter is trying to push without actually verbally saying, you know, well, what are you controlled by? What are you moved by? What are you pushed by? Are you moved by your own desires of the flesh? Or are you moved by the Spirit of God that lives within you? How you respond or react tells us what that is. But your call is not to live by the deeds of the flesh, but for the will of God. That's what he says in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. You're called no longer to live by the desires of the flesh, but for the will of God. That is your purpose. And as he seemingly moves through this, he gets into chapter 5, he doesn't leave the leaders without something to do. And the young men of the congregation, these are the two categories that he talks about, 1 through 5. The first command that we see in this passage is where he tells the elders to shepherd. The second is where he speaks to young men And he says, be subject to your elders and clothe yourselves with humility. Here's how you do to fulfill your role in the kingdom as a leader or a future leader. Shepherd the flock, clothe yourselves with humility, and be subject to your elders. This is what he's putting forth in front. But here's the other interesting part. Peter identifies himself with this body of people. And the word here is really interesting because when you see the word elder, behind it is the word presbyteros, which really means older man. Like this is an older man in a position. In some cases, in some contexts, this is referring to an actual office, like 1 Timothy chapter 3. Here, I believe Peter is speaking to an actual office. But he also uses the word episkopos, which is the other word that's used for elders or overseer, like you would see in 1 Timothy chapter 3. He says, if anyone desires to be an overseer, that's episkopos. If anyone is an elder, they are a presbyteros, an older man, because here's the interesting thing in the culture, in the towns, this is the way that they would make decisions for the towns, for the Jewish people. They would gather all the presbyteros together. And the older men would come together and speak for each individual family. And then based on the decision that was made for each individual family, they would come to a decision together in what was best for the community. Presbyteros describes their office. Episcopos describes what they do. And Peter uses both in this passage. And this is why I'm convinced that when he says, therefore I exhort the elders as your fellow elder, he's talking about an official office because of the use of those two terms in the same context. What they are and what they do. Therefore I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder. Look at this. This is really cool. He says, 1, I'm a fellow elder. 2, and I'm a witness of the sufferings of Christ. And number 3, I'm a partaker of the glory that is to be revealed. Peter puts himself on a scale. I think Peter beautifully exemplifies what it means to be a servant leader. He says, I'm not above you. I may be an apostle. I may have witnessed the sufferings. I may have been right there with Jesus. And I may have seen the things that happened to Jesus. But I am not above you. He says, I'm a fellow elder. Right? This is what I am, this is what I'm called, this is what I do, and I'm a witness to the sufferings of Christ and a partaker of the glory that is to be revealed. And then here's his command. This is really interesting. Shepherd the flock. The word for shepherd here is the same word that's used in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11 when he says, and he gave some as shepherds. The Greek word is poieomen, right? Shepherd, it's something they do, it's something they are. And then he says, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight. That's episkopos. That's what they do. Exercise oversight. But what's even more interesting is the way that he begins to break down the text for us and show us how we shepherd and exercise oversight of the flock. He says, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, not for sort of gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples among the flock. Peter exhorts the elders by telling them to shepherd the flock. That is your job. That is your requirement. That's what you do. You don't do it for these other reasons. Simon Sinek, an author and motivational speaker for leadership, says, leadership is not about being in charge. Leadership is about taking care of those in your charge. He said, this is the picture of leadership that we have to grasp. It's not about being over someone. This is where sometimes we get the contrast between godly leaders and politicians. Right? Politicians, they're after something that's for themselves pure. In fact, Paul mirrors this thought. He says, when you're servant leading, look out not for your own interest, but also for the interest of others in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4. It's not about being in charge. It's not about lording it over somebody. This is what he says. You're not lording it like the Gentiles lord it. This is not your responsibility. Among you, this isn't this way. You don't exercise your oversight for controlling someone's behavior. That's not the way the kingdom works. You are all in submission to Jesus. But Jesus allots certain individuals who express the gift of being an episcopos, of being a shepherd, of being a presbyter, of being an elder, to guide the flock in the ways of God. That's what he's calling these individuals to. Shepherd the flock. I also imagine Peter reflecting on his conversation with Jesus in John chapter 21. Remember that? They think Jesus is dead. They go looking for him at the tomb. They don't see him. The angel says he's not here, but he's risen. And so they go back to their occupations. They say, you know what? We're going fishing. And they go out and they got all sorts of things that they're doing. And all of a sudden, here's Jesus on the shore. And he comes and they come back to the shore, they rush back to him, and they're sitting there eating and talking. And you know what Jesus says to him? Feed my sheep. Shepherd my flock. This is what, if you love me, this is what you will do. Because of your love for me. So Peter understands this from a very dynamic standpoint, in that him and the Lord were having a one-on-one conversation, and the Lord tells him, feed my sheep. If you love me, this is what you will do. So Peter's not saying this from inexperience. Peter's not saying this just as, you got to do what I tell you to do. Peter's putting himself at the bottom, and he goes, you know what? Jesus told me what to do. Jesus was my servant. Jesus gave his life for me. This is not a position of authority in that I'm going to exercise my power and leadership over somebody to try to control what they're going to do. That's not real leadership. It's putting yourself at the bottom, not under compulsion, but intentionally, willingly, voluntarily, according to the will of God, not for shameful or sordid gain, but eagerly, enthusiastically, excited. Not lording, not as the master of someone. They are not your slaves. If you're an elder, the people in your body are not your slaves. And then he says, proving to be examples of the flock. He says, this is while shepherding and exercising oversight are your primary functions, I really want you to focus on this. Prove to be examples of the flock. You want people to live like I live. You want people to do what I do. In anything. You think about this. It applies to a myriad of things. If you want to influence your children to do good things, well, what do you have to show them? If you want to influence your coworkers to do good things and to be more like Jesus, you've got to act in such a way that they respond. You're proving to be examples to them in the workplace. I'm not saying that any of you aren't. I'm just putting it out there. We want people to change. We have to live by example, and I really do believe with my whole heart that your most powerful evangelistic tool, I know I said this last week, is the way you live your life. Is the things you reflect in your life. When people see you, do they see the Lord? Do they see the Lord through you? Do they see what you're doing? Do they see how you're responding to situations? Do they see how with what grace you give towards someone? How you speak, how you act, with your tone, your love, your compassion. Are those things you're following Jesus about, reflecting in your life? This is what a shepherd is supposed to be. And I'm not narrowing it down to shepherds. We don't have shepherds in this congregation. What I'm trying to empower you to do is understand that you have the ability to lead. You have the ability and the responsibility to, in some capacity, lead the people you are surrounded with in your life. whether it's here at church or it's at work or it's amongst your family. You have an opportunity to be influential and to shine the light of Jesus. You should take it. And then he says this, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of life. If you do and exercise this well, if you do your job the way that Jesus did his job, and you try in everything you do to not do it, to be an intentional leader, to be a voluntary leader, to be a servant leader, to put yourself at the bottom, like Jesus put himself at the bottom, giving his only two intangibles for the sake of humanity. He says, when he returns, you are going to receive the unfading crown of life. That's your reward for what you do in this life. And then he kind of transitions. He says, because there's this younger group of men, right? And always in a congregation, I hope this is, something on our minds about what we're doing in the future, is as training and being examples to the young men who attend this congregation. That is vitally, vitally important for us to take keen note of that. There's Ricky that sits in the back, and how many others that attend here on Sunday morning. How can we be examples to those individuals? I mean, I started in a cabin. I know I've talked about this before, but I'll say it again. Because I reflect on this all the time. And when I started in that cabin, my intention was not to influence these young men the way that I did. That was not my intention. That was not what I was trying to do. I thought they were fun. They were full of life. They were excited. They were exciting. And then when the time came when they were getting into their teenage years and they were rebelling, it was like they would come to me and they would ask me questions, and they would express concern or not like something, and I would try to the best of my ability to give them the best that I could, advice that I could that honored their father and mother. Now some of them are preaching. Now some of them are serving in their church on a regular basis as a song leader. Some of them are going to college to learn how to be a preacher. Something I didn't expect that. I didn't put that out there. But are we thinking about how our example, and I wasn't the perfect example either. I have my failures and flaws of my own. But who can we influence if we put Jesus at the front and ourselves at the bottom? For what cause can we impact by standing on the lowest step? Are we conscious of those things? This is all things that Peter's bringing out. He says, you younger men, this is the verse 5, you younger men, be subject to your elders. This is your job right now, because you're not in a position, you're not old enough, you're not in a place where you can be an elder. Your job is to be subject to the elders and maybe even learn from the elders. This is the same word we've seen all throughout this book about submission. Chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. In chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, when it talks about slaves. When it talks about the idea of being subject, being in the submissive part of the relationship, not in the authoritative part of the relationship. It's the same we would put ourselves in when we look at Jesus. Are we in the dominant position of the relationship, or are we in the submissive part of the relationship? I would hope that you would see yourself in the submissive part of the relationship. Because Jesus is your Lord and your Master, and He's directing your steps to do His work. And then he says, here's the other thing, because what you have to remember about young men is sometimes they're kind of cocky, right? Kind of arrogant. Okay? They kind of got that head built up. I got a 20-year-old man who just got married, and he's a 3-stripe black belt in jiu-jitsu. There's a lot to be arrogant about. He's worked his whole life for that. I got kids that are close to that, being that. But somehow they understand this principle of clothing themselves in humility. What he's saying is cover yourselves, like putting on a cloak, right? And buttoning it up. This needs to be a part of your entire being, to clothe yourselves with this humbleness, this humility, this gentleness, this meekness, not as a form of weakness, but as a form of strength. Do I have the humility to submit to the people that are worthy of my submission? And even if they aren't, that's what he's saying. Be subject to your elders. There are good elders and bad elders, right? There are guys that are really good at their job and they love their job and they're fantastic. And there are bad ones. There are really bad ones. And you just, they're like the contrast of the good slaves, the good masters and the bad masters. He says, don't just submit to the good ones because they're good. Also submit to the unjust and the unruly. He says that in chapter 2. Right? So why would it be any different for this category of young men? Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another is the phrase he attaches to that. For God, look at this, he quotes this. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He is in complete opposition to people full of pride. We could sit here and ask ourselves, is that us? Do we have the capability to sit back and go, am I full of pride? Yeah, sometimes. I'll be the first one to admit it. I'm full of it. And there are other times where I am on my knees begging God to forgive me. There are times where I get ahead of myself. I get my head blown up to the sky. And I'm full of pride. One of my issues, and this may be a common human thing too, I don't know how to ask for help. That's my pride speaking, not my humility. I don't know how to ask for prayers. That's my pride speaking, not my humility. And this is what I have to be keenly aware of. If I'm called to and commanded to clothe myself in humility, and I understand that God is in opposition to those who are full of pride, but he gives grace to the humble, what position do I really want to be in? Leadership is not about being served. It's about serving. To put ourselves in the lowest form, to stand on the lowest step, and serve as Jesus served. It's better to lead from behind the curtain than from the spotlight. It's not about looking for the spotlight or using your example and it is about using your example and your influence to build God's kingdom. As a reminder, I want to tell you and empower you tonight that you have the ability to lead through your own example. You may not be in a position where you could hold this office, or you may not be in a position where you want to hold this office, but you do have influence in the kingdom. Not as a demanding, commanding, but someone who is full of humility and love and compassion and grace. Let's stand and sing.